Hey folks, Sid here. Thank you for joining me this lovely afternoon, morning, evening, tea time, midday, middle of the night that you're joining me, or wherever it is, wherever in the world you are. Today I'm really excited because it's the inaugural episode of CITED, which is where I kick back, relax, try not to knock over my bookshelf like I did earlier this week, and talk to you about whatever it is that's striking my fancy in my research. So today I'll be talking to you about a woman called Alesoun Piersoun, who was a condemned and convicted witch in 16th century Scotland. If you see me look down, it's because I've got these glorious notes so I don't forget everything I want to tell you guys. So forgive me if I dart a little bit. So for this video, I've primarily used Robert Pitcairn's Criminal Trials in Scotland from AD 1488 to AD 1624. And I'll be using part 2 from the first volume. As well as using P.G. Maxwell-Stuart's Satan's Conspiracy, Magic and Witchcraft in 16th Century Scotland from 2001. Additionally, I have used a bit of a digital facsimile from a Broadside account in 1826, accessible through the National Library of Scotland, but that only kind of comes to play in at the end. So I've got some secondary sources that I'll link to in the description as well as in the blog post if you'd like some further reading. So, who was Alesoun Piersoun? She was a 16th century woman who lived in a place called Fife. This is the county in East Scotland right above Edinburgh. And according to what little documentation we have about her, she was born in about 1553. Now, if you look her up on Wikipedia, that's not her birth date. I think they list her in the 1530s. But according to the new biographical dictionary of Scottish women, it's 1553. So, just so you know. She was convicted of sorcery, witchcraft, and for invoking spirits of the devil, according to criminal trials. But let's back it up. That doesn't really tell you who she was, why she was convicted, and why she's such a big deal. She's from a place called Byril, but she worked primarily in St. Andrews. She was also a pretty sickly child. She had lots of ailments on her left side, but she had an uncle called William Simpson in Edinburgh, who was a healer and a doctor. And so she would frequently travel down south to receive treatment from him, as well as a little bit of training in the healing arts. So William Simpson is a bit of an interesting character himself. I won't elaborate much in this video. His family comes from Stirling, and as a child he was kidnapped by a giant and supposedly taken to Egypt. But Dr. Simpson was a renowned scholar in Edinburgh. He was a great healer, and he treated his niece until she was about 12. Where she traveled back and forth to see him. However, William wasn't just her scholarly teacher as much as he was her spiritual guide as well. And I don't mean in the sense like a pastor or some kind of clergyman might, but he came to her in spectral form. It's ambiguous from the court documents if this is because maybe he had died and she had some sort of otherworldly access. We don't know, or perhaps he also skilled her in the darker arts as well as the medical arts, and I don't think we'll ever find out, but it's an interesting little aside. So as Dr. Maxwell-Stuart points out on page 104 of Satan's Conspiracy, he could have been a spirit from beyond the grave or no longer human, some sort of transformation by the other world, or a shamanic guide that helped her by means of trances. So as I mentioned, they're both healers, right? Cool. But not so cool. According to Stuart MacDonald in The Witches of Fife, on pages 144 through 145, the ability to harm or heal was considered magic. So even though healing and medical knowledge is absolutely necessary for agricultural living for humans and animals in rural Scotland, it's still kind of precarious as far as the church is concerned. There's a very fine line in what's considered charming or what's considered witchcraft. And both were more or less immoral in the eyes of the church, just witchcraft was quite a bit worse. Charming was more akin to folk medicine, something that you might see more on farms, and witchcraft, of course, casting spells, invoking spirits, etc. So not only is this a primary concern for any healer, especially a woman, but we're in the midst of post-Reformation Scotland. So in 1520, Scotland makes the shift from being Catholic to Protestant, and so in such a place where the church makes most of these big decisions, everything is sort of hotly contested, especially things like witchcraft. So anyway, back to Alesoun. In this court trial, we not only just kind of read the third person omniscient court happenings, but we do get quite a bit of taste in Alesoun's own words, as it reproduces the first-person narratives that she's giving in her testimony that day. So while the court trial says, yeah, she communed and invoked the spirits of the devil, Alesoun corrects this, and she says, no, it's the fairies. And you gotta remember, so this is 16th century Scotland, right? The fairies aren't these cute little Victorianisms, these tiny little winged things that, yeah, perhaps they're a little bit pesky and they trick you, but no. The fae are these sublime beings, right? They intimidate you, they strike fear into your heart. They're not creatures you mess with. So Alesoun was often taken to a place called Elfheim, which is the realm of the fairies, by a whirlwind that rolls in off the coast and kind of transports her to this other plane of existence. And when she was in Elfheim, which is also sometimes called Elfheim due just to spelling variation, she became really good acquaintances with the Queen of Elfheim. So if you've heard of Andrew Mann, who was a warlock who lived up in Aberdeen, he was real good friends with the Queen's husband. So, kind of interesting. Anyway. And she joins their court and sees that she has some of her own kinfolk there. Now, Alesoun doesn't really elaborate on this. She could mean William Simpson, as he is her fairy spiritual shamanic guide of sorts, or this could be other humans, this could be her family, we aren't really quite sure. But perhaps the biggest players here from Elfheim are a sort of fairy that she meets called the Good Neighbors. Now, the Good Neighbors are not Alesoun's invention, neither is Elfheim, neither is the Queen of Elfheim. But the Good Neighbors are what seem to be a lower ranking of fairy, kind of the main populace, I suppose. So it is also these good neighbors alongside William who teach Alesoun how to heal in these special potions and salves that she will use in the human realm in and around St. Andrews. And so, however, even though Alesoun tells us in the early parts of the court document that she's made a good acquaintanceship with the Queen and she's good friends with the good neighbors, her relationship with them becomes a little bit complicated. So for a period of about 7 years, Alesoun says that she no longer sees the Queen when she travels to Elfheim. She doesn't say if perhaps the Queen was away or if Alesoun herself wasn't able to visit court. But regardless, these 7 years are marked and characterized with fear. Alesoun soon dreads the whirlwind coming off the coast that takes her to Elfheim, and she dreads the interaction she has with the good neighbors. So she goes on holiday with several of her friends to a place called Grangemiere, which is on the more southern coast of Fife, kind of between Pittenweem and Anstruther, and is now home to a quite lovely rundown estate and really nice holiday park. But her friends decide that, they're going to go to the beach one day. They're on the coast. It's really quite lovely, presumably this summer. But as I mentioned earlier, Alesoun was quite sickly in her early life, and so she's not feeling well this day, and she stays indoors. And while she's trying to recuperate, a man in green comes to her in this house. He just sort of appears. And if you're familiar with British and Irish folklore, very frequently fairies tend to wear green, and in stories or recounts, this is kind of how you can pick them out. Alesoun is ready and willing to welcome this green-clad, presumed good neighbor into wherever it is that she's staying, until something kind of weird happens. He tells her, "If you are faithful to me, I will do you good." And evidently this isn't very on par for her normal positive interactions she's had with good neighbors, so Alesoun cries for help, and no one hears her. So she rebukes him in the name of God, likely making the sign of the cross, according to Dr. Maxwell-Stuart on 105, and tells him, "If you are a man of God, you may come closer." But at this, he quickly flees. So it is this incident that Alesoun mentions that denotes the 7-year period where the good neighbors are no longer good, and instead potentially diabolical. In her previous experience, the fairies are not evil, but the sign of the cross drives one away. Is this some sort of diabolical or demonic figure running around in fairies' clothes disguised as a good neighbor? We don't know. But we do know in medieval English legendaries, which are stories of, saints' lives and martyrologies, that demons do kind of have a penchant for taking on the disguise of a pagan idol or pagan figure. It's quite possible that what's happening in this court document is evocative of that, or maybe this is how Alesoun understood it, because she comes from a Catholic culture. It seems to be a sort of intersection between post-Reformation, Catholic versus Protestant Scotland, as well as indigenous paganism versus Christianity. So to continue with the fairies, This man in green does come to her again, but this time, she says, he brings friends, both men and women, who are, of course, also clad in green. But what they do is they take her to Edinburgh. They sort of transport her overnight to this wild party where there's lots of alcohol and merriment that Alesoun's not included in. Instead, she's beaten and she's left no good use of her left side. So after Alesoun discusses these two very distinct memories of physical violence, she goes on to say that these good neighbors still were sometimes positive, and that they would teach her how to make salves and even cure her under the intervention of God. So we're seeing a very stark juxtaposition of the diabolical fairies and some that are performing sort of angelic miracles. But sometimes when they came to her, they were cruel again, and they would tell her, like the original green-clad man, that if she wasn't faithful, they would do her harm. And if she disobeyed whatever it is they were telling her, or told other people about their existence, they would murder her. But again we hear of William Simpson, who would come to her in bodily or spiritual form to warn her of the fairies' comings. He told her that she should avoid going with the fairies, for every year 1/10 of them go to hell as some sort of diabolical tithe. So here again we see this kind of fairy figure pinned between heaven and hell, and good and evil. It almost seems that they're paying rent on Elfheim with the lives of their own. This alludes to a very messy relationship between paganism and Christianity in this post-Reformation Scotland, where Protestants and Catholics are constantly pinned against each other. So ultimately, what gets Alesoun caught? We know that on the 28th of May, 1588, Alesoun is condemned and convicted of witchcraft. But how did we get from the 7 years of hardship to there? The answer is Archbishop Patrick Adamson. So Patrick Adamson is the Archbishop of St Andrews, and he's not having a real good time with newly Protestant Scotland, as he's Catholic. And he starts investigating Alesoun in 1583, so 5 years before her execution. Though he imprisons her, right, as he's doing all these other witches, rounding them up, throwing them in the St Andrews Castle, Patrick Adamson is a pretty sickly dude, and Alesoun Piersoun, as we know, can make some pretty fresh salves. So she helps him with a potion of ewe's milk, claret, herbs, and boiled chicken. And she gives him this diet that he's supposed to consume quite a lot of this a few times a day. And he ultimately lets her go from her imprisonment. And you may have heard, not sure, this relationship was very bodily referenced by poet Robert Sempill. Not super cute, but you can look at it if you're interested. I'll link it in the blog. So it's this relationship with Patrick Adamson that P.G. Maxwell-Stuart and I, because he's pretty cool, knows a lot about what he does, thinks that this is the nail in the coffin for Alesoun, so to speak. So as I said, she makes the sign of the cross. It's a pretty Catholic thing to do, right? And the High Kirk in Scotland out of Edinburgh, very freshly Protestant. So being Catholic ain't that cool right now. Though, what's so sad is that Alesoun didn't heal by magic. She doesn't practice witchcraft. What she does is a lot like what I said in the beginning, charming. It's just folk medicine. So, in Satan's Conspiracy, in the page range of 105 to 106, P.G. Maxwell-Stuart offers a few possible reasons why Alesoun Piersoun could have been convicted if she was just practicing folk medicine. So, previously to the Catholic Church, and then presumably then to the High Kirk, the High Protestant Church, fairies and Elfheim and anything that wasn't explicitly Christian was then considered explicitly non-Christian. So any kind of thing that couldn't have been mentioned in the Bible, i.e. fairies, would be inherently diabolical. The Assize then may not have convicted her because she was a female healer, as I think many of us would be quick to assume, but instead that she was just a person who had revelations and visions and communed with fairies. Not to mention, she said she was friends with their queen, their leader. He wasn't really buddy-buddy with the High Kirk, and at the time, he allegedly had consulted at least one other witch, one called Agnes Melville, who was based in Anstruther. So, considering all of this, the making the sign of the cross, being a female Catholic in a newly Protestant Scotland, a female practitioner of folk medicine, being friends with Patrick Adamson, and then all the fairy hoodoo, it just kind of seems like Alesoun Piersoun was dealt a bad hand of cards. And this is what brings us to the 28th of May, 1588, in Edinburgh, Scotland. Alesoun Piersoun was put on trial, she was convicted of witchcraft and sorcery and the invocation of spirits of the devil. She was 35 years old. So, Robert Pitcairn's criminal trials doesn't tell us what happens after her conviction, but as I dug up more and more about her, because there's not really all that much, I found in that National Library of Scotland Broadside account that I mentioned way at the beginning that, yeah, she was convicted, and she was condemned by the church, and then she was strangled, and then she was burnt at the stake. I've got no idea if she had any sort of family remaining, you know, William Simpson or not, but it's quite heartbreaking that she didn't do anything wrong. I think some people might suggest that she was mentally ill, hence the visions, and ultimately I believe that there's no good that can come of speculating. Was she mentally ill? Was she suffering some sort of ailment? Because we know she was sickly. Or was it real? You know, I think that in this sort of historiographical, literary, folkloric kind of study, it doesn't matter at this point if there's truth to the tale. Because we know what really happened. She gave this testimony, right? That really happened. That's truth. And if this was true for her, and this was true for, you know, those that she was speaking to at her court date, it's true enough to be spoken about, because that was the reality they lived. And so I think that's what I'd like to leave you with. So if you aren't a medievalist, or, you know, someone who studies the Renaissance or anything like that, you might think of truth as being hard, factual, and objective. But no, when you think about stories, and you think about folklore, and you think about legends and myth, and or whatever, any kind of tale, it doesn't have to be true for it to be real. Because if it affects somebody else's reality, or affects the reality of the tale, people live by it, then it's true enough to be studied. It affected the lives of people that believed it, and so they lived it. They were, I guess, in 2020 speak, they were living their truth. And so that's why we study it. That's history. Thank you.